Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy my stories. Please like and subscribe, and hit that notification icon so you never miss out. Now on with the stories.
The whole thing started with that little gnome. It sat on the corner of Marcie's lawn no more than a foot tall, and sported the usual red hat, white beard and mischievous grin you'd expect from any garden gnome. But apparently, this wasn't just any gnome, it was a threat to the neighborhood, according to Karen. Karen was the type who liked to keep the entire block under her thumb, constantly sticking her nose in everyone's business. So when she saw Marcie's gnome, she was somehow offended. She called it an abomination, claiming it brought bad energy, and that it didn't fit the vibe she wanted for the neighborhood. Before we knew it, she was going door to door with flyers in hand, preaching her crusade against all gnome-related decor. She was relentless, shoving pamphlets into people's faces about how gnomes represented rebellion, and brought an unsettling atmosphere. I have to admit, I didn't know garden gnomes held such power, but Karen was dead serious. She showed up on my doorstep with one of her infamous flyers, practically vibrating with determination. "We have to take a stand," she said, her voice low and intense. "These things bring negativity. Marcie's house is practically cursed now. Are you with me?" I glanced down at the flyer she was holding out. It was laughably over the top, with a giant red X over a gnome and a list of reasons why gnomes were spiritually disruptive. I stifled a laugh which didn't go unnoticed by Karen, whose face tightened in a way that made it clear she didn't appreciate any dissent. "I think it's just a decoration, Karen," I said as diplomatically as I could manage. She stared at me like I just spat in her coffee. "Just a decoration," she repeated, voice dripping with disdain. "You'd think that, wouldn't you?" Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and stomped off to my neighbor's house, her flyer waving wildly in the air. Not surprisingly, her campaign didn't go over well. Most people thought it was ridiculous, and some even started putting out their own gnomes just to irritate her. By the end of the week, there were gnomes popping up in every yard. Some people went all out, decorating their lawns with entire gnome villages, complete with little mushroom houses and miniature ponds. Karen was beside herself. She spent her days pacing the neighborhood, scowling at each new gnome as if it were a personal insult. Then, just when we thought Karen's antics had reached their peak, she escalated. One night we woke up to find her camped out in front of Marcie's house with a massive sign that read, "Gnomes are not welcome here." She was holding a flashlight under her chin like she was telling a ghost story, glaring at Marcie's gnome with an intensity that was downright unsettling. This protest continued for 3 nights. Karen would sit outside from dusk till dawn, glaring at Marcie's gnome and muttering to herself. The rest of us couldn't help but watch in morbid fascination, but Marcie finally had enough and called the police on night 4. Karen was escorted home, but the warning did little to dampen her enthusiasm. If anything, it made her more determined. A few days later, Karen announced that she had taken matters into her own hands by forming a new HOA, which she insisted had authority over the entire block. She marched down the street, loudly proclaiming that we were now all members, and as such had to follow her bylaws. I received an official-looking letter in my mailbox the next day, declaring that we were to remove all unauthorized lawn decor or face penalties. The letter even had a signature from Karen as the president of the new HOA. No one took her seriously, at first. It wasn't until she actually started sending out fine notices that we realized how far she was willing to take this. The fines were outrageous too. $50 for each gnome, $100 if she deemed it particularly offensive. And it wasn't just the gnomes. She had a list of violations that included things like parking too close to her house and playing music that could be heard from the street. If you were unfortunate enough to receive a fine, it came with a threat of legal action if you didn't pay. When people ignored the fines, Karen upped the ante. She started placing liens on houses, or at least trying to. Somehow, she'd learned just enough legal jargon to sound convincing, and she'd show up at your door with stacks of paperwork, insisting that the liens were binding. "This is an official lien notice," she'd say, waving a document in your face. "Pay up, or you'll be forced to sell your house. Those are the rules." Marcie, ever the bold one, laughed in her face and slammed the door on her. That only fueled Karen's fury. She made it her mission to purge the neighborhood of what she saw as rule breakers. She cornered people in their driveways, demanding they either follow her rules or move. She even showed up with her ridiculous bylaws, waving them around and claiming she had full authority over the entire block. At one point, I overheard her telling someone, "I'm going to clean this place up. By the time I'm done, there won't be a single gnome left." It was madness. People started avoiding her, ducking into their houses whenever they saw her coming. Some of the neighbors even filed lawsuits to get her off their backs, claiming her liens were illegal and her new HOA was nothing more than a figment of her imagination. But Karen didn't back down. She started collecting her evidence, keeping a meticulously detailed list of every supposed violation and penalty. When the court date arrived, the neighborhood practically buzzed with anticipation. Karen arrived, all smiles, convinced she was going to emerge victorious. She didn't even bother hiring a lawyer. Apparently none would take her case, not that she thought she needed one. She strutted into the courtroom with her bylaws clutched under her arm like they were holy scriptures. The rest of us sat in the gallery half expecting her to pull off some bizarre victory through sheer force of will. She strutted up to the front when her case was called, practically beaming. "I have all the evidence right here, Your Honor," she said, holding up her stack of self-authored documents with a self-satisfied grin. "These are the rules I established. I am the new HOA president, and they all agreed to abide by my regulations." The judge took one look at her evidence, and I swear his eyebrow twitched. He picked up the bylaws and flipped through them, his expression shifting from confusion to barely contained disbelief. "Ma'am," he began slowly, "are you suggesting that you unilaterally created a homeowners association and assumed legal control over this neighborhood?" Karen's grin never wavered. "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor. And according to my bylaws, I'm entitled to impose fines and collect payments." There was a long pause as the judge processed this, and for a split second I almost felt sorry for her. But then the judge leaned forward, looking over his glasses at Karen with a look that could melt steel. "You cannot simply invent an HOA and impose bylaws on other people," he said, his tone cold and unimpressed. "You have no legal standing to do so, and these fines and liens you've been issuing are fraudulent." Karen's smile wavered. "But I wrote the bylaws. I made it clear that everyone had to follow them." The judge didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, this is not how the law works. You cannot impose penalties or issue liens without legal authority. This entire thing is nothing short of harassment." Karen's face turned a deep shade of red. She opened her mouth to argue, but the judge held up a hand, cutting her off. "You're lucky your neighbors are only seeking relief for the damages caused by your fraudulent actions. I strongly recommend that you consider yourself fortunate that no criminal charges are being filed, for now." The word criminal seemed to take a second to sink in. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure outrage. "This is an injustice," she shouted, her voice shrill and shaking with anger. "I'll sue you. I'll sue every one of you." The judge's eyes narrowed and he leaned forward. "I would caution you against making further threats, Ms. Karen. Your behavior has already crossed multiple lines." Her face twisted with rage, but she clamped her mouth shut, realizing that she was already standing on shaky ground. The judge turned to her neighbors and declared, "The court finds in favor of the plaintiffs. Ms. Karen is hereby ordered to cease all HOA activities, and any fines or liens she imposed are declared null and void. Damages will be awarded to cover legal fees and the emotional distress she has caused." As the gavel came down, a small cheer went up in the gallery. Karen was practically vibrating with fury, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. She stormed out of the courtroom muttering dark threats under her breath. But as far as the law was concerned, her new HOA was officially dead in the water. That wasn't the end of her antics, though. The judge's recommendation for criminal charges must have scared her off the legal path, at least for the time being. Instead, she went back to her old ways, knocking on doors and ranting about gnome conspiracies and neighborhood moral decay. But nobody paid her any mind. As far as we were concerned, Karen was just a nuisance now, her reign of terror officially over. But Marcie's gnome stayed right where it was, a permanent little reminder of the Great Gnome War and the legendary fall of Karen's imaginary HOA.
If you like our stories, then please like and subscribe and comment, and remember to hit that bell icon so you never miss out. We have new stories almost every day.
Karen lived 2 doors down, and we all knew to brace ourselves any time we saw her peeking out her windows. She was the sort who complained about wind chimes, or if a car engine idled too long. So when the Jeffersons decided to throw their annual summer pool party, the whole neighborhood just waited for her to make some sort of scene. None of us were disappointed. That Saturday, the weather was perfect. Blue skies, the smell of burgers grilling, the sound of kids laughing and splashing in the Jeffersons' pool. Everyone looked forward to this party. It was the one day when families, neighbors, and friends gathered for some much-needed fun. Karen, of course, didn't receive an invitation, and she made it clear she didn't want one. About an hour into the party, someone whispered, "Karen's on her porch." I glanced over, and sure enough, there she was, standing with her arms crossed, wearing her typical scowl. She glared at the Jeffersons' backyard, her mouth a thin line as if she could somehow will the music to stop. You'd think the Jeffersons were holding a full-blown rock concert instead of a family pool party with a boombox quietly playing some oldies. 10 minutes later, Karen disappeared back inside, and we thought maybe that was the end of it. We were wrong. The first police car showed up not even 20 minutes later. The officer, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, approached the Jeffersons' gate. Mr. Jefferson, the most easygoing guy in the neighborhood, walked over to talk to him. From where I stood, I could see Mr. Jefferson gesturing to the pool, where kids splashed and played, and then over to the food tables where the adults were chatting and eating. The officer looked around, gave a quick nod, and left without incident. But that didn't stop Karen. 10 minutes later, we heard her shrill voice echo across the lawn. "This is ridiculous. I pay my taxes just like everyone else. You need to do your job." She had marched out to the sidewalk, practically chasing after the officer as he got into his car. He seemed to sigh, muttering something as he drove off, which left Karen standing there, her face red, fists clenched. You'd think the world was ending based on her expression. The Jeffersons just shook their heads and tried to continue with the party, but Karen wasn't having it. 5 minutes later, she was back on the phone. From our vantage point, it was pretty obvious what she was doing. With her phone pressed to her ear, she paced back and forth, gesturing wildly toward the Jeffersons' backyard, her mouth working overtime. Soon enough, another police car pulled up. This time, 2 officers stepped out. One was the same young guy from before, and the other looked like he'd been on the job for a couple of decades. They exchanged a look as they walked up to the Jeffersons' gate. This time, Karen came storming out of her house, waving her arms like she was directing traffic. "Finally," she called out to the officers. "Someone is here to restore some order." She pointed at the Jeffersons' backyard, where, once again, kids were laughing and splashing around. It was a family party, for goodness sake, nothing more. But Karen continued, her voice climbing higher with every word. "These people are disturbing the peace. I can't even sit in my own living room without hearing that." She spat, gesturing to the kids with an exaggerated cringe. The older officer looked at her, raising an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this looks like a family gathering. They're just having a good time." Karen's face contorted, and she leaned in, jabbing a finger in his direction. "This is disturbing my peace. This isn't just noise, it's harassment." The officer's partner seemed to suppress a laugh, but Karen didn't notice. She had launched into a full-blown rant, detailing how her Saturday had been ruined, and how she was a taxpayer who deserved protection from this chaos. She demanded that they arrest Mr. Jefferson, or everyone at the party for that matter. The officers exchanged another look, and the younger one shrugged. "Ma'am, they're not breaking any laws. We're not going to arrest anyone." Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "Then I'll file a lawsuit. Emotional distress. Do you have any idea what it's like to deal with this noise?" The older officer finally cut her off. "Ma'am, calling the police repeatedly for non-emergencies is a misuse of our time. I'm going to ask you not to call again unless there's an actual emergency." Karen, however, was undeterred. She glared at them both, her fists still clenched. "Fine," she spat, "but if they keep disturbing me, I'll have to take matters into my own hands." One of the neighbors muttered, "She's about to go nuclear." The Jeffersons, still trying to be good sports about the whole thing, turned the music down a notch. It was already low enough that you could only hear it if you were in the yard, but they didn't want any more trouble. Still, that wasn't enough for Karen. She kept pacing her front lawn, fuming, waiting for some reason to call the cops again. We all watched her, half amused and half terrified of what she might do next. Sure enough, as the sun began to set, the faint sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the Jeffersons' yard set her off again. She marched out, her phone in hand, loudly threatening to call the cops one last time. This time she told them, "I'll stay here until you do something about it." When the officers arrived, again, they were visibly irritated. The older officer sighed, his patience clearly worn thin. "Ma'am, we've been here 3 times already. We're not going to keep responding to noise complaints about a simple pool party." Karen crossed her arms defiantly. "Then I'll stay right here until you make them leave," she snapped, planting herself on the sidewalk like she was staking her claim. The younger officer, clearly tired of the whole situation, raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, you're not allowed to just stand in front of someone's house like this, especially if you're harassing them. You need to go back inside." Karen scoffed, looking at him like he'd suggested the most absurd thing imaginable. "I'm on public property. They're the ones causing a disturbance." At this point, the Jeffersons and most of the neighbors had gathered near the fence, watching the whole scene unfold with a mix of disbelief and amusement. Mr. Jefferson walked over and in the calmest voice asked Karen, "Why don't you just let it go? It's a pool party. We're not hurting anyone." Karen turned to him with an expression of pure disdain. "You people think you can do whatever you want, don't you? No respect for anyone else." The officers had had enough. The older one looked at Karen and said, "Ma'am, if you keep this up, you'll be the one getting a citation." That seemed to momentarily stun her. Her mouth opened and closed as she struggled to find something to say. Finally, she settled on a huff, shooting one last death glare at the Jeffersons' yard. "Fine," she snapped. "But this isn't over." She stomped back to her house, slamming the door so hard that even the cops flinched. The officers shared a look of relief before heading back to their car, and the party resumed, albeit with a little less enthusiasm. We all kept glancing toward Karen's house, half expecting her to burst out again. But she didn't. Later that evening, as the party was winding down, someone joked, "Well, there's the annual pool party, plus one extra guest appearance." We all laughed, though there was a tension in the air. Karen was like that storm cloud that never quite goes away, always lingering and waiting for the next excuse to rain on everyone's parade. That was Karen for you. If there was joy to be had, she'd find a way to ruin it.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.